Should you use a Mac Mini, a personal computer, or a virtual private server to get your OpenClaw or any other open source agent system set up? In this video, if you watch till the end, I'll show you the pros and cons of the difference of whether you are doing a setup on a virtual private server, personal computer, or say a isolated separate device like a Mac Mini. By the end, you'll know exactly what setup is right for you and if it makes sense. There's no one-size-fits-all option. It really just depends what you're working with and what your eventual goal is. But without anything else to say, we're going to jump right into the computer and let's get started. And I'll explain the best one for your needs. Welcome in. We are in. This is a very popular question by a lot of people getting started, especially with OpenClaw or any of these systems where you can download it in, say, a personal computer, Mac Mini, or say even a virtual private server. So we're going to be talking about the three different ways how you can pretty much get these up and running, especially if you're just at the very beginning, you don't know where to install it. You know how to install it, but the thing is you don't know which one's secure, which one's the safest, which one may fit your needs right now versus at a future time. So we will go over everything around that. All right, let's just start off with the personal computer. So what are the pros and cons of the personal? So let's just start with the pros. The pros are you have more access to your context because context is king. Think about it. If you have a bunch of files, a bunch of directories on your computer all there, then you don't have to really provide any other sorts of context. You could just prompt a bot, it could work with the files. And especially if it has like admin root access, then yes, it can. Unless you're putting it inside of a container like with Docker, then it's not. But if assuming you are giving it root admin access, then it has more context. It can do more things. It can access more files. It's like getting pretty much Claw Desktop on your computer. And then it can pretty much work between different files that you give it access to. So context is king. Another pro is that it's already free. You are running it on your own machine's resources, so you don't need to get any other sort of piece of hardware or another virtual private server. You have full control over the hardware, what kind of settings are on it, your computer resources, so everything is limited to its specs, but nonetheless, you have full control. Additionally, there are no ongoing costs because you already have the machine at your disposal. You don't have to do an upfront investment into another computer or say a virtual private server. So everything's just on your computer. You can get it literally running in a matter of minutes if you set it up right. Also, it gives you easy access into your agent's files and workspace because when you're working, say, in a isolated environment, so if that is separate from your computer, if it's on a virtual private server, there are different ways how to access the files because one of the biggest advantages you have when you're on your actual computer, you can easily just quickly see text edit files. Like if you're using the app on your Mac, say like text edit, you can see the markdown files of the sol.md or the memory.md or any of these other files that the agents are modifying in real time. You know what I mean? So whatever you modify, it just gets automatically modified to the agent's brain. Whereas say if you are working with a Mac Mini or say even a virtual private server, sometimes depending on your setup, you might either have to use a syncing service where the files sync to both devices. Otherwise, you might have to remote mount the device onto, or say the disk onto your computer, so then only then you can access it. And especially if you're in a virtual private setup, it's going to be a bit more difficult because you don't have like the graphic user interface like you have here on, say, my computer. It's not going to be like visually pleasing. So the way you go around that is like what I do with people is I always recommend to go with Obsidian because then you can just mount the disk on your computer and then from there you can just visually look at everything with Obsidian. Now, when it comes to cons, the biggest con is, especially if you give it a lot of access, just root admin access, this thing can do something that breaks a rule, modifies a file, deletes something. Doesn't mean it's gonna delete. You know what I mean? So when people are wondering like, hey, is this thing safe on my device? You know what I mean? It's not like you just install it and it just starts doing things. The only way it becomes unsafe is depending on, say, what kind of rules and instructions you give it inside any skill or any, say, like memory or agents.md file, like what you prompt it and what its task is set out to do, or say any scheduled cron jobs. So when you have these scheduled cron jobs and they're out there doing things autonomously, especially if you're not by your device, this thing can probably do something if you're not monitoring in real time what it's doing. And then all of a sudden, like you're wondering why something is missing from your computer. Or say you have a very sensitive and important directory in your computer that you don't like it being modified, or say you don't like it being accessed, but then, you know, all of a sudden this thing deleted everything. You know what I mean? So like these cases are very serious and it's possible it can do that. So that's why what people do is they isolate the environment. It's like if you're working with an employee or something like that, you want them to have full access to your whole entire computer. Probably not, you know what I mean? But nonetheless, if you know what you're doing, it doesn't mean like it's automatically just going to do these, especially if you're using really premium models. Because if you're using really premium models, they anticipate your needs. They know exactly kind of like what the prompt is, what to do, what not to touch. You know what I mean? They might as well even ask you before they even do anything. Whereas a cheaper hallucinating model, of course it's going to mess up. You know what I mean? Like they tend to be less in intelligence, but like more faster in performance sometimes. It really depends. But That's one big trade-off. Another one is that it requires your machine to stay on and running. If your machine is not on and running, then these cron jobs aren't going to be work, especially if it's like fully off. You know what I mean? They're not going to be running, and you can't really be texting this thing back and forth. So that's like the biggest con, because one of the biggest pieces of value that people see online when you're using this thing is like you can message it anytime, you can talk to it, you can be somewhere around the world, and this can go out there and do tasks for you, right? That's ultimately what you want. You want this thing to be working for you 24/7. But say if you're limited by your own personal machine here that you're using, then it can't be running if it's fully off. You know what I mean? Another one is internet dependency, whereas say if you're using something like a virtual private server or Mac Mini, then if your internet goes down, this thing can't do work. You know what I mean? It can't do work. You can't access it, you can't message it, so that's a big problem. Also too, sometimes depending on what this thing is running, if you are hosting anything else on your computer, if you have a lot of machines and applications running at the same time, this is all using your own personal computer's resources. So it can slow down your performance. Maybe if you're running, say, even like local models or something like that, like all factors into the specs of your machine. So the more stuff you have happening, more cron jobs, more things, more background processes that are simultaneously happening in parallel, this is all eating up your computer's resources, and it can slow you down. Now let's talk about having a dedicated hardware for your OpenClaw. Now, the first thing is when you are running this thing, you have kind of a lot more power, you know what I mean? Because now you have an isolated environment. Now, for instance, because this thing eats up a ton of tokens, millions of tokens. In the past 30 days, I burned over 800 million tokens running OpenClaw. So unless you're using cheap models, and if you're using premium, then these things are going to be cutting a lot into your operating costs. Now, the way around that is twofold. You can either use OpenRouter free models, which I mentioned in a previous video, or what you can do is you can download open source language models and then drop the cost to zero, because they're pretty much just running off your machine's resources. When you have a isolated environment, clean resources, not many things happening other than what you're running this OpenClaw thing with, then you just have consistent performance. The uptime's always good. Performance is always good. You don't have to worry about, say, turning off your computer and then not having this thing access you. It's a massive benefit because this thing's online 24/7. That's ultimately what you want, especially if you're getting an AI assistant to be doing work on behalf of you. You know what I mean? It's a huge trade-off if you're using a personal machine and next thing you know, you have no internet, or say, it's technically still too, if it's like within your local proximity and your internet goes down, this thing's going to be down. But nonetheless, if it's separate from your own machine, you still have the advantage of having an isolated environment for this AI to run and do its thing. Another pro is you have a one-time cost. So unless you already have a separate machine, maybe a separate laptop, maybe a desktop you don't use anymore, or whatever, even a Mac Mini, then it's just a one-time cost and then no additional worries about monthly billing or other sorts of subscriptions. There is more privacy here because you don't have to really go through the hassle of setting up proper security, firewalls, reverse proxies, disabling. So that it just makes it a lot more easier just to run off local host, which is off your machine, and you're not risking putting yourself out there on the internet where you could potentially be hacked or even taken advantage of if someone discovers how to access your dashboard or your AI. I mentioned this before, but it's an isolated environment for your AI. When you have an isolated environment, it's pretty much like its own space to work and do things. You know what I mean? I got my stuff. I want my things to be separate. So does the AI. You know what I mean? Unless you give it certain permissions to, I think that's the best dynamic how to work with the AI. But you give it a isolated environment, and then it can just work and do its thing in that. And then also too, you can easily access the agent's files too. Assuming you can open up the files, you can find the workspace, you can see all the text edit files or all like the markdown files that your agent is creating. You don't have to do anything crazy where, say, you're like mounting a disk on your computer or whatever. It's all accessible. Now, when it comes to cons, the first big one is the upfront cost. You have to actually invest into the hardware you're about to use. You need to set up and handle all this stuff yourself. So if there are any updates, maintenances, anything that you have to do separately on another computer, that all does kind of take some time. But at the end of the day, you are running your own machine here. If something happens to the hardware, then you're going to have downtime. Now, I know I mentioned here electricity costs. That's a minor one. But if you're running some like crazy intensive machine that uses a lot of resources, then that's where it can kind of become problematic. And especially too, if you see people online talking about Tailscale accessing the computer or the piece of hardware remotely, that's also possible, but you don't have to do this. But if you want to, and say you connect it to your internet and then you want to say access it remotely when you're not home or whatever, then you are going to have to do that upfront time investment in order to set this up so then you can remotely access the computer machine. And the problem here, once again, is if this thing is offline, down, or something happens when you're away, then you can't access it. Now, when it actually comes to virtual private servers, once again, It has very similar pros to having a hardware because it's an isolated environment, as I mentioned before. You subscribe to a plan based on subscription specs, so like what kind of RAM it has, what kind of memory it has. You can pick and choose your providers. I know AWS offers a free tier for about a year. You can pick and choose between, say, something like DigitalOcean. You can pick and choose between something like Hostinger. I know there are other services out there that are offering their own plans too for virtual private servers. Some people are even creating their own virtual private server networks inside of their own home. So, I mean, if you have the technical capability to do that yourself, you can also do that and look into that, and that would be free, but then you would have to run it somehow, right? All the maintenance is really hands-off. It pretty much has a 99% uptime because it is maintained by a service provider. So anything that has to be done or worked on in the cloud on the service provider that you're working with, they're going to take care of it. A lot of these service providers also offer very quick one-click installs for your AI, so you can just get quickly up and running. You can also install on it local LLMs, and this is with an asterisk, because if you rent out something with limited amount of space, then it's going to cost you, then you're going to be forced to upgrade because you can't run these local models. You know, I mean, if you're running, say, something with like a couple billion parameters, then this thing's going to eat up a lot of your resources, if anything, all of it. You know what I mean? So unless you're running a super small, tiny model, then maybe, yeah, you can download it and then it can run it and do its thing. But just also keep in mind, it's going to run into the issue of having actually eating up the computer's memory, the resources. So it can slow down your processes and perhaps just fail. So if you do plan on doing something like that, then you're going to want to consider something that has more computer resources available. I mentioned before, but there's a monthly subscription here. Small upfront cost, but the trade-off is you can get started really fast. You know what I mean? So rather than investing into, say, a personal piece of hardware or getting this thing on your computer that you may feel insecure about, which is totally fine, I always just suggest get started with a virtual private server. It's the fastest thing, and you can always migrate your files from, say, your current environment to another one. Because at the end of the day, you just have a assigned workspace for your AI, and they're just files at the end of the day. You know what I mean? So you can always just copy and paste, migrate everything over to, say, a personal machine, or maybe a machine you specifically bought, or even maybe another cheaper provider with a virtual private server, right? So you can always just migrate these files, reinstall OpenClaw or whatever you're running the AI on, or even if you just wanted to have access to your previous context and memory sessions, then it's all going to be there. They're just files. Now, the cons, as I mentioned, there is going to be a migration that you would have to do if, say, you were to change the provider to, say, another virtual private server or another machine. So that does take some time, especially if you don't have the technical capability. There is an upfront time investment or even a cost to like work with someone to migrate all this stuff. It's probably not going to be much. It really just depends on who you're working with, but just letting you know that is a factor you have to consider. I know a service like DigitalOcean that once you cancel, everything is gone. You know what I mean? Everything is gone from the space, from the virtual private server. So if you do not migrate, this is essential. You have to migrate your stuff. Otherwise, everything's going to be deleted. It's not like they keep your stuff there forever. So if you cancel your plan and then your plan runs out, all your stuff is gone. So you have to make sure you migrate. Another con is that you may have to at times access the terminal in order to access what the heck is going on inside the virtual private server. So whether that's through console or through, say, SSH, like secure shell into the virtual private server, because sometimes you may have to, say, restart the gateway, or you may have to modify a specific file. Maybe you want to see personally what the environment configurations look like. So there has to be a little bit of minor technical accessibility into the virtual private server, which is kind of a con, but nonetheless, if you have the shortcuts and the commands, it's quite easy, especially if you know what you're doing. You can't really review the remote files unless you mount it onto your device or you have some other methodology in order to see everything that's going on, you know what I mean? So if you're doing like terminal commands and console commands to see what the heck is in files, and that is super annoying. That's why usually what I do is I just mount the disk onto my computer and then I can see everything in my Obsidian. So for instance, this is the brain of my OpenClaw on my virtual private server, and this is mounted onto my computer. So I open it up with Obsidian, which is free, and then I can pretty much just work and edit the files from here, which get updated automatically in the virtual private server. There is going to be an ongoing subscription, so I didn't mention that. Resources are limited by the subscription plan, so if you don't know what you're doing, you can always just start off with something simple, anything from 2 to 4 gigabytes of RAM to anything from around 20 to 80 gigabytes of disk storage. So that's what I would suggest. Usually those plans can go from anywhere around like $5 to, say, $25 per month, but it really depends. You can always upgrade up with service providers, but some of these service providers, like once you upgrade up, you can't go down. So it's better just to start with something that has low resources and then upgrade your way up if it only makes sense. Now, the other con is there's less security. You have to pretty much set up the security properly, especially if you're working with webhooks, especially if you're working with ports and firewalls, then your environment is isolated. So you have to open up specific ports in order to make certain processes, APIs, or events actually work. Otherwise, it's not going to work. So there is a bit of a technical gap that you have to be aware of. Otherwise, some of the softwares you're trying to run or some of the setups that you're trying to get created in your OpenClaw are just simply not going to work because it's all contained and isolated. And if you set this up wrong, then, God forbid, something happens where someone can access you. And one more thing on security is that, there are a few ways how to set up the security. So whether you're creating a password in order to access the VPS or say like secure shell, I always recommend secure shell is the most safest way. You pretty much just create an access key on your computer, pair it with the virtual private server, and then that's the only way how you can access it. That's probably the most secure way because then only your device can access it. Otherwise, if you do say a password, that's something that can easily be attacked and then say just brute forced inside of it. Now, I created here a comparison chart so you can kind of pretty much see everything. I just want to make sure you see everything here. So upfront costs, you can see here that when you're doing something with personal or say something with a Mac Mini or say with a virtual private server, the personal is the cheapest way, one of the fastest ways you can get set up, but then the costs kind of rise when you're choosing your hardware. Ongoing costs, so we got that here. Maintenance, very low when it comes to like personal or virtual private server. Privacy, always better and optimal when you're using a personal machine or piece of hardware, but when you have the virtual private server, depending on how it's set up, some of them have like basic security setup, but if it's not set up right, then you expose yourself to risk. One advantage running with say a personal computer is you can start running local models, so you can save a lot on cost, especially if you're running millions of tokens every single week. 24/7 availability, I think this is a big one. So if you have your own dedicated machine or a virtual private server, you can always access the AI, whether through a communication channel or on a dashboard. And then best for, I think in the beginning, what's best is if you want to do something fast and cheap, either personal, but I would always opt for the virtual private server just to keep it separate because you can get up and going pretty fast, just get the basic setup, and then you're up and running. Whereas say if you have your own Mac Mini or a piece of hardware, you can also get set up with that, but I don't recommend doing that right away because if say you don't want to spend say $500 on this thing, the next thing you know, there's something else out there, or say you find, or say you figure out you don't even need this thing or you don't want it, right? So only invest more money and resources into a personal piece of hardware when you know that this is right. So before you know this is right, unless you're absolutely certain you want to do this thing for the long term, or you envision yourself using more AI frameworks and open source agents, then opt for the piece of hardware. Otherwise, in the beginning, for experimentation, to taste whether or not this is something for you, and just to invest some skin in the game so you can kind of like feel it out whether or not it makes sense, then start with either the virtual private server or personal PC. But if I had to pick one, I would always suggest the virtual private server. It's separate from your environment. You can have this thing up and running 24/7. You can start in as little as say $5 to $7 per month, depending on who and where you buy it, even free with AWS. But the problem there is a technical gap in setup that you are going to have to go through. So I'm just warning you. I'd rather just go with something like Hostinger or something like DigitalOcean to set you up and then you're up and running. But other than that, that was the video. I hope this gave you a clear idea in terms of what to look out for, how to think through what you're picking, and then which one's the best fit for you right now. If you're an absolute beginner and you're just trying to get this thing set up, or you're just trying to get up and rolling with it, the safest probably way to do it is with a virtual private server. If you have some technical capability and you're comfortable with running this thing on personal PC, that's also absolutely fine. You can do that, and don't get scared that this thing's just gonna wake up all of a sudden in the middle of the night and just delete all your files. That's not how it works. It only works like that if you prompt it or schedule some sort of task in order to go do something. So what I mean? It's not like it's just gonna randomly wake up and just start doing things unless there is a schedule for it or if you're prompting it. So if you feel comfortable with running it on your PC, then do that. That's fine. Long-term investment, especially if you're going to be running other future AIs or agents or any other resources with your CPU or GPU, then definitely consider investing into a piece of hardware. I'm actually thinking of at some point getting a dedicated piece of hardware, maybe even building it myself. I'm not too sure, but as you can see here, the more we move forward into like AIs and having our own agentic systems, it becomes a huge piece of leverage when you have your own machine running, right? Especially if you know that your internet is up and running, you can always rely on that, then it's going to be a huge advantage. Otherwise, if you can run into, say, bad weather, or say your internet is not reliable, then probably just opt in for the VPS because it always has like a 99.9% uptime. Hope you enjoyed the video. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.